Percentages are super important. Percentages are used every day to calculate things like, well, how much sales tax you pay when you buy something, how much something costs when it's on sale, how much fiber is in your granola bar, or how much money you can make if you invested in the stock market. That's all real life stuff for sure. So you can see that it's really important to understand percentages and how we use them in math. A percent is a special fraction that always has 100 as the bottom number. If it's a percent, then no matter what the top number is, the bottom number will be 100. In fact, because the bottom number of a percent is always 100, we don't even write it. Instead, we use this handy little symbol called a percent sign. Whenever you see this symbol after a number, it means the number is a percent. It's really a fraction with 100 on the bottom, but it's just being written in this more compact form. Like this number 15 here. It's got the percent sign after it, so we read it as 15%. And because a percent is really a fraction that always has 100 as the bottom number, we know that it means the same thing as 15 over 100. Percents make even more sense if you know what the word percent means. The prefix of the word, per, means for each, or for every. And the root word, cent, is Latin for 100. That's why there's 100 cents in a dollar. So percent literally means per 100. And that's why they're shortcuts for writing fractions that have 100 as the bottom number. If a percent always has 100 as the bottom number, then how can we use percents in situations that don't involve 100 things? Like if you scored 90% on a test, but the test only had 50 questions on it. 90% means 90 out of 100, but how can you get 90 questions right if there's only 50 on the test? Like if you hear on the news that 65% of Americans like watching football. 65% is 65 out of 100, but I'm pretty sure there's more than 100 Americans. The fact is that percents are used all the time to describe situations where the total involved is either more or less than 100. So how does that all work? Well, the key to understanding how percents can be used in all these situations is to realize that percents are equivalent fractions. To see this even more clearly, let's think about the test I mentioned where you got a score of 90%. 90% is the same as the fraction 90 over 100. But since the test really only had 50 questions, the actual score must be an equivalent fraction with 50 as the bottom number. And even though we don't know what the top number would be, we can figure it out because we know that our actual score is equivalent to 90 over 100. Notice the relationship between our fractions' bottom numbers. 50 is exactly half of 100. So we could go from 100 to 50 by dividing by 2. And that means if we do the same thing to the top number, divided by 2, we'll get the top number of the equivalent fraction. And since 90 divided by 2 is 45, 45 over 50 is equivalent to 90 over 100. And now we know that our actual test score must have been 45 out of 50. Okay, now I know what you're thinking. If our actual score was 45 out of 50, why not just leave it like that? Why did our teacher convert it into a percentage? Well, one important reason is that converting things into percents makes them easier to compare. For example, suppose a student took 5 different tests during the school year, and each test had a different number of questions. Here's the scores they got on those 5 tests. 40 out of 80, 18 out of 30, 12 out of 16, 96 out of 120, and 19 out of 20. Since each test score looks really different, it's not so easy to tell how well the student did or to see how their scores changed over time. But what if we convert each of these scores into an equivalent fraction with 100 as the bottom number? In other words, their equivalent percent form. Wow, now it's much easier to compare the scores. So just like a scale of 1 to 10, percents give us a way to quantify things on a common scale, using numbers that are easier for us to relate to. And that's especially helpful when we're dealing with complicated numbers, like numbers that are either really small or really big. Remember our example about Americans in football? We used 65% to describe how many like watching it. Well, the actual numbers might look something like this. 205,636,600 over 316,364,000. That's a lot of people, and that fraction's not very easy to imagine. But the equivalent fraction, 65 over 100, is much easier to imagine. And it tells you that for every 100 Americans, 65 of them like watching football. We're going to learn how to find a percent of a number. Finding a percent of a number makes more sense if you remember that a number just represents an amount and that a percent is really just a fraction. So finding a percent of a number really means finding a fraction of an amount. Think about it this way. Let's say the number 20 represents an amount, like the amount of ladybugs that you found at the park one day. And let's also imagine that you agreed to give 25% of all the ladybugs you found to your little sister. Okay then, so how many is that? If you have 20 ladybugs, how many is 25% of that amount? That's what it means to find the percent of a number. You're finding out how much that percent or fraction of the total is. In this case, since our total is 20, we need to know what 25% of 20 is. So how do we figure that out? Well, it's really easy if you remember back to one of our fractions videos, the one about multiplying fractions. In that video, we learned that when dealing with fractions, sometimes the word of is used instead of the multiplication symbol. When they say find 1/2 of 16, they really mean find 1/2 times 16. Well, guess what? Since a percent is just a special fraction, of means the exact same thing with percents that it did with fractions. When we have 25% of 20, that means the same as 25% times 20. Great. So all we have to do to find a percent of a number is to multiply. But how do we multiply a percent and a number together? Do we just forget about the percent sign and multiply the numbers together? No. If we did it that way, our number would be way too big. 25% should be a smaller part, or a fraction, of 20 ladybugs. But if we did 25 times 20, we'd get 500 ladybugs. Clearly, that's not the right answer. Here's what we have to do instead. Remember that when you see a percent written like this with the percent sign, it's an abbreviation for a fraction. In this case, 25 over 100. So we need to use that fraction form when we multiply, since we're really multiplying by a fraction. Now some of you may also remember that percents have a decimal form. We'll get to that in just a minute. Okay then, if we use the fraction form of our percent, then our problem becomes 25 over 100 times 20. Now that's a problem we know how to do. To multiply fractions, we just multiply the top numbers, and then we multiply the bottom numbers to get the answer. And we can just write 20 as a fraction by putting 1 as the bottom number, because 20 over 1 is the exact same value as 20. So, let's go ahead and multiply. On the top, we have 25 times 20, which gives us 500. And on the bottom, we have 100 times 1, which is just 100. So our answer is 500 over 100. Now 500 over 100 might seem like a strange answer, but that's just because we still need to simplify it. 500 over 100 simplifies to 5 over 1, and 5 over 1 is just 5. That's much better. So 25% of 20 is 5. Alright, so to find a percent of a number, we just need to multiply the fraction form of the percent by the number, and we have our answer. But there's another slightly different method that you can use that works especially well if you're allowed to use a calculator. In our first percentages video, we learned that percents have both a fraction form and a decimal form. We've already seen how we can use the fraction form to find a percent of a number, but we can also use the decimal form if we want to instead. The procedure starts the same. If you need to find 25% of 20, you first replace the word of with the multiplication symbol. Next, we'll replace the percent, but with its decimal form this time. 25% is the same as the decimal 0.25. Then, all we have to do is multiply. And although I could easily do the decimal multiplication by hand, I happen to have a calculator, so I'm going to use it. I just enter 0.25 times 20, hit equals, and I get 5. Yep, that's the same answer we got when we used the fraction form of 25%. Oh yeah. So that's how you find a percent of a number. You just multiply the number by either the fraction form or the decimal form of the percent. Either way will give you the right answer, so you can choose whichever will be easier for you to do. Let's see a couple more examples before you practice on your own. This next one involves money. Pretend that your best friend has a job walking dogs and offers to give you 35% of whatever he earns if you help him walk some of the dogs. If your friend earns $80 that week, how much of the money will you get? In other words, you need to figure out what 35% of 80 is. Okay then, let's start by replacing the of with the time symbol. And next we have to decide if we want to replace the percent with its fraction form or its decimal form. I think I'll use the decimal form for this one, which means I'll replace the 35% with 0.35. Now, all we have to do is multiply 0.35 times 80, and that's 28. That means you'll get $28 if you help your friend walk those dogs. Cha-ching! Okay then. In the last two problems, we found a percent of a number, which, like we learned at the beginning of the video, just means finding a fraction of an amount. And like you'd expect when finding a fraction of something, the answer was smaller than the amount we started with. But remember, fractions can be improper too, which means that their value is greater than 1. And in the same way, percents can be greater than 100%. So you might come across situations like this. Suppose that last year your school had 400 students, but this year it has 120% of that amount. Well, 100% would mean the exact same number of students as last year. So 120% must mean that there's more students now. But how many students? To find out, we need to calculate what 120% of 400 is. Great, we know just how to do that. We just multiply 400 by the fraction form or the decimal form of 120%. Let's use the decimal form again. To get the decimal form of 120%, we move the decimal point over 2 places to the left, and we get 1.20. So we multiply 1.20 times 400, which gives us 480. So this year, there's 480 students at school. All right then, that's how you find the percent of a number. And it's a really useful math skill that has a lot of real-life applications. So it's important to learn how to do it right.
So first off, how do you go about, and how fast could you work out, say 15% of 80? You got the answer of 12. Yeah? Now I'm going to tell you how I worked this out really quickly. Now this works on the idea of just a couple of things. And I'm going to jot these down now. First off, I'm going to introduce the idea of 100% of a number, 50% of a number, 10% of a number, and 5% of a number. Now, we're going to be using this a lot in this video today. 100% of a number is the actual number itself. So an example, 100% of 80 would be 80. Okay, 100% of 70 is 70. 100% of 720 is 720. 50% of a number is half of the number. It's half of 100. Okay, because these are percent numbers. These are out of 100. Okay, this is 100 out of 100, so it's a full amount. This is 50 out of 100. It's half the number. So half of 80, 50% of 80 is 40. 50% of 12 is 6. 50% of 32 is 16. It's half the number. Now we can work out 10% of a number, which is 10 parts out of 100, really easy, because it's the same as dividing by 10. So 10%, we just divide this number by 10. So 10% of 80 is 8. 5% of a number is just half of 10%. So 5% here would be 4. Okay. Now, we're just going to use this idea in this video today. So remember those, these are what you need to know for working out these numbers, okay? So 15% is made up of two things. It's made up of a 10% portion and a 5% portion. 10% of 80 is 8. 5% of that is half of this, so it's 4. And then what we do is we just add these together, because 10 plus 5 is 15. We're just adding these guys together. 8 plus 4 is 12. Just a nice one for the minute. What about we do this one, 60% of 42. Now, what you might notice, I'd pause it and try to give it a go. You might try to work out what it's made up mainly of. Now, the easiest way of getting there is a 50% number. If you remember, that's half, and a 10% number. Okay, and then you're going to add these together. So 50% is half, which is 21. 10% is you're moving this decimal place. You'll get really good doing this, is 4.2. And you're adding these together. Okay, you're going to see I've lined the units up there. You'll do this in your head. So 21 and 4.2 is 25.2. Alright, I'll go another one here. This is a bit of a harder one. I'm going to use the idea of a 100% number here. I'll give you a bit of a heads up on this one. I'm going to work out 95% So you might be taking something away of 720. Okay, so give it a go. Okay, so the idea is we're going to have 100%. Usually you wouldn't need to really think about it like this. It's just this number here, which is 720. And we're going to take away 5%. So we have 720. A 10% would be moving here, the decimal place, so it would become 72, and half of that would be 36. We're not adding this on, by the way, because it's 95. This is 100 take away 5, so we're actually going to take this away. So 720 take away 36. Hopefully get really fast at these, is 684. I do have other videos where we look at how to rapidly subtract things and rapidly multiply things. Okay,